Matthew chapter 15 tells a story, a really interesting story, about a Canaanite woman. In other words, a lady that was not a Jew. So she really wasn't a part of God's family yet. She was considered a Gentile. And back in those days, Jews and Gentiles didn't get along. The Gentiles despised the Jews, and the Jews hated the Gentiles. Well, this woman had a problem, though. Her daughter was demon-possessed, and the Bible actually says cruelly demon-possessed. And she knew that Jesus had the power to heal her daughter. And so she comes crying out after Jesus, and she says, "Lord, have mercy. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus ignores her. Doesn't say a word, the Bible says. Just silent treatment. Well, the disciples finally come to Jesus and they say, "Lord, this lady's crying out for you. Would you please send her away?" And Jesus, he says it out loud. Now, whether she could hear or not, the Bible doesn't completely tell us, but he says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Well, she must have heard it, or else she'd acknowledged that Jesus was ignoring her. And she somehow breaks herself in front of Jesus, and she bows down in front of Jesus, like blocking the way. And she says, "Lord, have mercy on me. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." And Jesus finally speaks to her and says, "Woman, it's not right to give the children's bread to the dogs." In other words, I've come first to the house of Israel. They are the children of God. And it's not okay to give the bread of life to anyone else yet. Israel first, Jews first. Later we know, the Bible tells us clearly, go into all the world and preach the good news, that whosoever shall come. And it's not just for Jews, it's for Samaritans, it's for everybody, including Gentiles like me. Well, the woman has an incredible response, bowing there before Jesus, and she says, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." And Jesus looks at her and he says, "Oh, woman, your faith is great. Be it done to you as you wish." And the Bible says at that moment, her daughter was healed. But if you think about this story and you see, and I've heard sermons about this before. I think D.L. Moody preached a really great sermon about this back in the 1800s. But this woman was an awesome example of persevering in prayer. Now, if you had to think about the word persevering, first off, what does that mean? I think if you were to define the word persevering, I would say it means you don't lose heart. You don't quit. You're just going to keep on drawing near to God, even when you feel like He's not even watching, He's not even helping you, He's not even looking at you. Or in prayer, if you have something that you know is God's will. I mean, it's certainly God's will for a little girl to be set free from a demon, without a doubt. It's certainly God's will for me to be forgiven of all my sins, without a doubt. It's certainly God's will for me to be provided for as long as I'm seeking first the kingdom and His righteousness, without a doubt. It's God's will for me to have wisdom and so on and so forth. There's so many promises in the Bible, but you have to persevere in prayer. In other words, you keep asking and you don't stop asking until the answer comes. This woman is a great example of that. First off, Jesus gives her the silent treatment. Have you ever prayed and felt like God's not even answering? Well, that's what this woman felt like. The second thing that happened was Jesus' disciples, the church, mistreated her. Have you ever been hurt by the church? Well, that happened here. He said, "Send her away." Man. Then finally, Jesus himself calls her a dog, compares her to a dog. I don't know very many women that would keep on trying at that point. But she doesn't even argue. She doesn't give a face. She's too desperately in need of her daughter's healing. And she says, "Yes, Lord." But even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Just the humility, the desperateness of a mom crying out for her daughter. And Jesus brightens up and just looks at her and says, "Oh, woman, your faith is so great." The Bible says without faith, it's impossible to please God. Faith pleases God. You know, the purpose of even having to persevere in faith, persevere in prayer, is really most of the time a test. Now, sometimes there's spiritual warfare going on that's hindering your prayers. The enemy is also fighting. But I think God knows about those things, and whether he is the purpose or it is the result of the need to persevere in faith, but it's normally about, persevere in prayer, it's normally about a testing of your faith. You see, persevering in prayer and faith go hand in hand. I think of the parable that Jesus told whenever he, in fact, he even says the purpose of this parable was so that you would pray at all times and not lose heart. That's what the Bible tells us in Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Talks about the woman who wanted justice from her enemies, and she went to the unrighteous judge. And the unrighteous judge, not a godly man, didn't fear God at all. And the Bible tells us that she just kept pestering him day and night until she received the justice that she needed. Finally, the judge comes to the woman and says, "Woman, it's not because I'm godly. In fact, I'm not. And it's not because I fear God. It's just because you're wearing me out. So I'm going to give you the request that you've prayed for, that you've asked for." And then Jesus compares that unrighteous judge and he says, how much greater is God? Come on, he is going to give you justice and he's going to give it to you speedily for those who, quote, are you ready? They cry out day and night. You see, crying out over and over and over. That's the will of God until something happens. I've heard on a billboard once, I remember seeing this big billboard that says push, P-U-S-H. And then for each one of those letters, you've got a word. Pray until something happens. That's called praying through. That's called tarrying or waiting in prayer. And at the end of that parable, in Luke chapter 18, Jesus says these words. He says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? You see, faith and persevering in prayer, they go together. If you had to sum up or define the word perseverance, and you're only allowed to use 3 words, can't use 2, can't use 1, can't use 4, just 3, what would you do? What would you say? I think I would say just don't lose heart. I think that's the greatest definition of perseverance. Think about Job. If there was ever a man that had the right to lose heart, it was Job. First off, the enemy takes away his children, all of his livestock, his servants, all of his riches. They're gone in one day. And you can think, well, there's no other way that this could happen except for an act of God. God allowed this thing to happen. Now, he never sinned by charging God with the wrongdoing, but he knew God was involved. The Bible says that though he slay me, Job said, yet I will trust him. Job never lost heart. That's perseverance. And then his own body was attacked by the enemy, but he never lost heart, and he never charged wrong with wrongdoing. He never sinned in that way. And then eventually God really came through for him, and everything was restored to him even more so. Have you ever had a time in your life when you had to persevere in prayer? A time when maybe you prayed and then things got worse instead of better. Or maybe a time when you prayed and you felt like it was total silence. No answer. A time when you prayed and then maybe even the church mistreated you. Maybe a time when you prayed and the deadline was coming, and then the deadline, your deadline, not God's, but yours, came and went. But Jesus says, don't quit. You know, there's a story in the book of Daniel. It's chapter, I think, Daniel chapter 10, verse 12, talks about how Daniel prayed. And he started fasting for 21 days. And then on day 21, God sent an angel, and he said, "Oh, Daniel, from the very first day that you started calling on me, the answer was on the way. From the very first day you started calling on God and asking for understanding, the answer was on the way." God said yes, and he sent the answer. But it took 21 days for me to get here because I was hindered by the prince of Persia. In other words, there was some spiritual warfare that was taking place for the angel, and it prevented him from arriving right after God sent the answer. What would have happened if David would have stopped praying? Would the answer have been stopped? I don't know. But I know what the Bible tells us. Just because the answer doesn't happen right away, you don't stop trusting, and you don't stop praying. You push. Pray until something happens.